right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I know it's been a very long time since we've had an episode, but I've been busy with the post-production of this new movie, 43 Degrees North. However, we're going to be recording a bunch of episodes this month. It's currently April in the year of 2024, and my goal is to record a bunch of episodes and stagger them for release just so that we can get the production back into, or the podcast back into production and back into releasing regular episodes. But this movie has kicked my butt, and I do apologize if you were really into the show and into these conversations, and I haven't been honoring my end of the bargain here. And so I'm going to try and rectify that very, very soon, starting with this episode, actually. Today, my guest is Ron Felber. This is his second visit to the podcast, and he actually reached out to me personally to see if he could come back on because he has a new book coming out called The Unwelcomed, and he was kind enough to send me a galley, so I was able to read it. And it's an amazing book. It's about demonic possession and murder and intrigue, and it's all a true story. But it's a true story written in novel form, which is totally Ron's speed, and he's very good at it. If you ever read the Mojave Incident, it's sort of the same idea where he takes this true story and he just novelizes it, but it's all still very true. It's kind of like making a feature film out of a true story where the story is true, but it's been reenacted as a dramatic film. That's sort of what he does as a novelist, and he's really, really good at it. And so The Unwelcomed is the true story of Clara Fowler, who was possessed by a demon. And it's set in Fall River, Massachusetts in the late 1800s. And we talk in depth about it, but we also talk a lot about his research process, his writing practice, how he builds sort of these characters that are based on real people, but where they're just kind of serving the needs of the story, and sort of the line he draws to be able to balance, the truth of those characters versus what they're doing to serve the story. And it's something I've always wanted to talk to authors about, but we never really had the right authors on with the right projects. But this is the first time we're having an author on with the right project where we can actually tackle that, because I am really into historical fiction and how you sort of create these stories around real events using real historical figures, but can still keep it a novel that serves the function of telling a story. So that's kind of what this podcast is really about. We do go into the paranormal a little bit because it is about demonic possession, and it is a subject that interests me. It's always fascinated me. Ever since I was in the 7th grade, I learned about it. If you grew up in the 90s and you homeschooled like me, you might remember Days of Our Lives when Marlena was possessed by a demon. And she had green eyes and talked in a really deep voice, and it was super creepy. And it was the only year I homeschooled, but it was the perfect year because watching Days of Our Lives at 9 a.m. with my mother, trying to see what happens with Marlena's possession was just so fascinating to me. And that it was after that I learned about The Exorcist and all these other stories that they probably borrowed from for the Days of Our Lives scripts. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here. Please have a listen to my conversation with Ron Felber, and I'll see you on the other end.
So how you doing today?
It's good. We are currently having a nor'easter, and the snow is coming down hard. So if I lose power, that could happen.
All right.
That way you know what's going on. Yep. It started last night, and we lost power 3 times last night.
Yeah, I feel really bad about that because the weather here is very nice.
Where are you?
I'm in Florida.
Well, of course.
I'm in Naples, Florida. I'm in Naples, Florida. And I think it's I'll tell you what it is. It's 78 degrees. No, 68. And it'll get up to probably 75 or something. But I keep wishing for just to make everybody feel better for bad weather, but it doesn't come.
Yeah. Well, you guys will get like bad weather like next spring.
Well, yeah, what
or
happens
next
really
autumn.
is the hurricane season.
Yeah,
We have hurricane season, and then things change, which is really strange because, like yesterday, for example, it was sunny, 82 degrees, and 50-mile-an-hour wind. So just sort of picture that, right? So trees are blowing all over the place. The sun is out. It's 82 degrees. What a lovely day, except the wind is like tearing things apart. It's crazy. Crazy weather patterns.
Yeah. I I just moved back to my home state of Maine in August, and I was not mentally or just physically prepared for how cold it is. I'd forgotten because I spent 20 years in New York City,
Right.
spoiled by all the non-winters we'd been having. And
Yes.
then
Right.
it just every other week it's just huge snowfalls, really cold. Our heat can't keep up with it.
Yeah. Yeah. My son is in New York, but like a lot of people, he's thinking of leaving. He's just sick. Frankly, he's sick of the taxes and he's sick of the high rent. And like, where's he looking at? He was looking at New Orleans, but I don't think he's going to do that. I think he'll wind up in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia.
Philly's a nice town, and that was actually on our short list of potential places to go if we decided we wanted to stay in a city,
Yes.
because it's just an earshot from New York if we wanted to go back
That,
for
that's
anything.
that's his thought. Yeah.
But
Except crime is awful there. So he
yeah,
had a particular place, and above it was a boxing gym and an MMA gym.
huh.
So, or below it actually. And so he was 2 floors above this gym. So he likes all that stuff. So I said, well, that's great. You'll meet some people, some guys and this and that. So he says, well, what do you think? He showed me the rent and this and that. I said, call the police department and ask them what the crime is like there. He did. It turned out like guys were shot there in the middle of the street, like, 3 days ago. I said, maybe you just don't need all this crap.
Yeah, that's the type of neighborhood we were living in for years. But then after Sophie was born, we're just like, nope. Like
It's a
it was
different, it's a
great as a
different ball
starving
game.
artist. Like I can deal with the syringes on the ground and all that when you're an artist and you're by yourself. But like once she entered the picture, I'm like, yeah, all
Sure.
this is unacceptable.
Yeah, yeah. No, you need to protect your kids. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously. So you're in the movie business these days, I think.
I've always been.
Oh yeah. I just saw
It's
a
sort of
couple, I guess.
I kind of do all of it. If I can tell a story in the medium, I try to work in the medium,
Yeah, I
whatever
see.
that is. And so it annoys the hell out of people because people want to be able to put you in a box. Oh, you're a writer, you're a filmmaker, you're a
Yes.
podcaster. Actually, I'm kind of all of it.
You're a
And
Renaissance man. That's who
yeah,
you are.
the thing with film though is I can only make them at certain points. Once the perfect storm of things come together. So
Oh yeah.
you've probably been seeing my 43 degrees north posts.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
so that was a perfect storm that kind of started the first year of the pandemic and slowly just kind of came together until we got the location out on the island and got the right actor who can cry on demand, which is really important when you're doing a
That's
story
a
about
talent.
grief. And then, yeah,
Actually, the only other person I know that could cry on demand like that was my ex-wife, but that's another story.
especially during the proceedings. So,
Yeah, that's
so
right. No, then I was crying during this. Then I could cry on demand.
yeah, so we shot that last autumn, which is why I haven't been releasing podcast episodes because it's such a cumbersome project. But
Yes.
the goal
Yes.
this month is to start recording again and resume the show. And
Well,
so
I'm pleased to be back as one of your first guests
I'm
then.
pleased to have you back, and I'm so glad you reached out to me because this topic is my speed, 100%. We're
Yeah.
going to talk about the paranormal. We're going to talk about the psychological, and I'm really interested in your process as a writer. Basically, taking this true story and turning it into an amazing novel. And so,
Yeah. So I think you maybe got to look at it, I hope.
yeah, oh yeah. I also have it open here,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
we
Okay,
can
good.
go into the
Yeah, I'm,
pages
I'm
if we
very
have
proud of
to.
this book. I think, an incredible amount of research went into it. And I think and by the way, they're making the audio book now.
Who's
So
who? How'd you find the voice for that?
I didn't. The publisher
Oh,
found the voice for it. It's a guy. I'll tell you his name. Just give me a second, okay?
sure. Yeah, we
Just
should push it. Push it now.
escape escapes me at the moment. Brewer.
Brewer.
John Brewer.
Oh, I don't know him. I know a few
He's
of
done,
these
he's done
guys,
quite a
but
bit of television and
yeah,
like that. So, uh, it's good. It's spooky, and he does it really spooky, like with the different voices and stuff.
yeah.
So, like when Clara turns into this demonic presence, it's got this exorcist kind of voice, and when you hear it, it really sends chills down your spine.
Yeah. That'll be a fun read or a fun listen. The Yeah, so we talked a little bit about it in your previous episode with me, but I think we should go back over the backstory because I loved hearing about how you left your manuscript for Blatty and you refused to let it be left on the pile
That's
with all
right.
the other chumps and like I'm no chump.
I'm a
I'm
contender.
from Newark. You're
I'm
gonna
a
give it right
contender.
to him. Yes. So can you go over that story for us? Because some of the audiences might, who are listening to
Sure.
this,
No,
might not have listened to the
absolutely.
last one.
I love that story, and really, I'll pat myself on the back to this extent. It's really a story of incredible perseverance. I mean, that was 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. So in essence, I've been working on this freaking book for 50 years. I did a first cut at it, like a documentary. And I said, I'm going to do this because it's so dramatic in and of itself. I'm going to do, I won't change a word. And that was a, mistake because at the end, you could take the most dramatic thing in the world, I don't know, World War II, and say, well, on this date, this happened. And, this guy went to this college and so it's not a story anymore. It's just a list of facts and dialogue. So what I decided to do from a writer's standpoint, many years later, 50 years later, was to treat it like I tell my students to write, which is basically, Eric is next to me at a bar. I have a beer in front of me. He has a beer in front of him. We don't know each other. I tap him on the shoulder and say, you're not going to believe the story I came across in Boston, Massachusetts the other day. It's about, and tell the story sort of that way with a narration that's user friendly and that if I'm excited about it, it comes across in the language. If it's terrifying, which in a lot of parts, as it is, you say, this scared the hell, she was really freaked out. It was really incredible to see what happened. This woman talked in different voices, to different languages, that kind of thing. So there's a kind of excitement to it that a standard, just this what happened, this is what happened. And I'm sure in your documentaries, they call it narrative fiction, but I'm sure in your documentaries you do the same. It isn't just facts. It isn't just, well, this is what happened. Here it is on a table. Go look at it. It requires more than that. It requires pacing. It requires timing. It requires character development. If you don't understand these characters, who cares? There's a boxing match, and it's just two guys that you have no idea who they are, and you're watching, you have no great interest. But if it's Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, Frazier's undefeated and Ali is undefeated, and they're both truly great athletes, and the records and whatnot of both, now you're interested in the boxing match.
Well, because we know their story.
That's right. And you root for somebody. So this guy's a lot like me. So I want him to win. And now you're into it. You're into the sporting event, you're into the book, you're into the story. And I think that's really, I think one of the hardest things for a writer to do is find the right voice to tell the particular story, the right narration.
So, well, let's go back. Let's go back to you. You got this book from, or the book idea from Blatty, right?
Yes.
So he's the original author of The Exorcist. He was going to write
Correct.
this. What was his reason for not wanting to pursue it?
I think, I guess we have to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody that just had a best-selling book for 56 weeks, number one on the bestseller list, the New York Times bestseller list. a guy that just signed a movie contract for millions of dollars, with Billy Friedkin directing French Connection and the rest. And
Great director.
yeah, great director. I think he wanted to write a book about his mother. And so he wrote a book right after that called I'll Tell Them I Remember You, which was sort of a sentimental journey back into his childhood and his mom and like that, and how he grew up and so I think he was just in a different sort of temperament. And the idea of doing another story that involved exorcism and whatnot, I just don't think was on his plate at the time. Many years later, he did Legion, but many years later, I mean, I don't know how many, but I would say, bear with me, 30 years later, he did Legion, which became Exorcist 3. He had nothing to do with Exorcist 2. He hated it. Everybody hated
I
it.
never bothered with it.
So I think that had quite a bit to do with it. The other thing, Eric, is this. The story isn't just about exorcism, as you know. The exorcism is a rather small portion of the book. Really, this is a story, as I call it, of science, murder, and the paranormal. And really, in a lot of ways, it's a psychological thriller or even a murder mystery because there are three murders involved, which Blatty knew nothing about. He did it. He looked at it. I hired a detective to find out the backgrounds of the real Clara Fowler because they used a pseudonym, Christine Beauchamp, for the book that Prince had written. He had redacted any of the names, and for good reason. And so what I had to do was to research. Like I said, me and a detective worked, and he was just great at genealogy and that sort of thing. And so he could track the real name, then he could track the parents, then he could track the city marshal, Rufus Hilliard, Rufus Bassett Hilliard, and the fact that Rufus Bassett Hilliard was the investigator for the Lizzie Borden axe murders in Fall River, was the investigator for the Juan Corriero axe murder in Fall River that happened 6 months later, and 3 miles away. And he also uncovered or was very suspicious of the two deaths of Clara Fowler's siblings, Bessie, who was 4 days old, and Charles, who was 4 days old, separated by 3 years, but both died under very suspicious circumstances. And he believed the father, John Fowler, who was an alcoholic and a wife beater and just a pretty horrible guy, was responsible. So he wanted Clara Fowler to testify against her father, to give her evidence that this was a murder. And if you look at it from that standpoint, in a town that hadn't seen a murder in 50 years, you had the Lizzie Borden axe murders. 3 miles away or so, you had another brutal axe murder. And maybe 4 miles away from that, all in Fall River, you had the murder of Bessie and Charles Fowler. So that's an interesting dynamic. And I think Blatty didn't know anything about that because that's not what he was researching. He didn't care beyond the idea of exorcism and demonic possession. So I think that had a lot to do with it.
Yeah. Well, I love how you actually interconnected all of that, because it's I mean, let's face it, Lizzie Borden's the elephant in the room. Whenever I hear the name Fall River, that's what comes to mind.
Sure, yeah.
Or the rhyme, Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, but also being from New England, like, I just loved how I knew all the areas you were talking about, all the cultural references, all the people, so many names that I recognize. But I want to start with, I'm so interested in your research process. So Blatty gives you this. What was the first things that you received in terms of just, here's this project that I don't want, take it. What do you get from him? Does he give you documents? Does he give you just the
No, no,
idea?
not at all. What he did, he said, I'll paraphrase it, obviously. He said, basically, you're not going to believe this story. And it's a treasure trove of information at the Harvard Medical School Library because Morton Prince wanted to write a book, wanted to overshadow Sigmund Freud as the sort of pioneer of modern psychiatry. And so he documented everything and kept great files, had a stenographer present for the hypnotic sessions and the psychiatric sessions, had people there, William James for much of it, Richard Hodgson, I think, for all of it, Leonora Piper, the clairvoyant of the time. So he had assembled this sort of a team, and George Waterman, who was also a Harvard Medical School graduate. And, and they studied this from a variety of points of view, from a spiritualist point of view and from a psychiatric point of view. Prince was hell-bent on setting the direction for modern psychiatry into the 20th century. He thought he had almost a feud with Sigmund Freud, who believed in psychoanalysis, sexual fantasies, childhood, everything really kind of boiled down to sex and childhood experiences. Prince was a behavioralist, a lot like a B.F. Skinner, Beyond Freedom and Dignity kind of guy, that basically, if you're schizophrenic, it's because you have a chemical imbalance in your brain. If you have multiple personality, it's probably because you maybe have a lesion in your brain. So that things had a physical cause, so in the brain, that caused these symptoms. And he was convinced that demonic possession was like that there was some physical cause or some catastrophic event that set it off. Whereas Sigmund Freud would probably go back into the past, talk about Clara Fowler's sexual or lack of sexual experience, etc. Clara Fowler, who Prince called the saint, and the second consciousness, who he called the demon, she had visitations. So she wanted to be a nun. So she was registered at Radcliffe College, which is a very highbrow institution. So she's very bright. And she would have visitations from Jesus Christ and from the Blessed Virgin, and wanted to be a nun. And then all of this started happening, creeping into her life like sort of rising water, just a slow burn until it became monstrous. But, maybe to answer your question a little more specifically, Blatty didn't give me any information. He cleared the way at the Harvard Medical School Library with the curator there, that I could go there and get into the files. And so he had, a massive amount of information that was archived there. And so he called a guy named Wolf, I think David Wolf, and I got a letter saying I could use this material, which for me was like, wow, that's what I wanted, a letter from the Harvard Medical School Library that I could use this for my book. And so I sifted through all of the information. A lot of it was redacted for good reasons, which maybe we'll get into it a little later. But so most of my research came from the Harvard Medical School Library, the detective who traced genealogy to get the real names of people and the backgrounds of people, and a book that Morton Prince wrote, which was a little bit misleading in some ways, because he wanted to prove it was dissociation and not demonic possession. And that was called Dissociation of a Personality. And it was published in 1906. So that provided a lot of information, albeit he left out big chunks of information, the murders, for example, the names, for example. And oddly enough, in one of the strangest turns you could imagine, Clara Fowler was actually cured. And in 1904, so from 1898 to 1904, and wound up marrying Dr. George Waterman, who was the heir to the Waterman Penn fortune, and a prominent Harvard-educated doctor, and became a socialite. So no one knew that this was Christine Beauchamp, which is the name that the pseudonym that Prince used for his book and his records.
So
Isn't that
so
crazy?
that is crazy. That's a really great way. That, like, I wouldn't have, even
You
in my
couldn't invent this.
imagination, I wouldn't have come up with that.
You could not invent this kind of stuff, right?
That's funny. So you go you venture up to the Harvard archives, and how long did you spend up there? What time commitment is that?
I spent many hours and many days. I went there. I would spend 5 days at a time and just go and sift through this, do interviews, get whatever I could. There were other articles that were like reference articles. So in the files, there were other things that were written about this. He gave, well, for example, his daughter, who was named Claire, wrote a biography of her father. It never got published, but it was there. And in the biography, she tells from her point of view what went on at their home, because his office was literally on Beacon Street, 458 Beacon Street in Boston, Beacon Hill. And so she, was familiar with Clara Fowler. She could smell the ether. She heard the commotion. She heard conversations about it and discussions with the team of physicians. And so that was, that's again a treasure trove of information from a whole other point of view.
So so when you're up there, are you just looking to digest whatever they have that is on this subject, or do you already have a story in mind? And you're the way I would instinctively do it is I'm looking for information to fill in kind of an outline that I already have. But that's just my process. So what does
Yeah.
your process look like from not the way the creative sort of
Mm.
interacts with the research?
Yeah. You see, in the very beginning, you're young, you're 22 or whatever. And so you don't have you're excited to do all this. And so it's a much more superficial investigation than if you're, I don't know, 60 or whatever. It's a whole different mindset. You're much more patient. You ask more questions, and it's not so superficial. And so originally, I took it like Blatty did. This is a case of demonic possession and exorcism, and that's all I cared about. And so a lot of the detail at the time, I said, well, all right, that's nice. That's nice. So they married. Okay, that's nice. But then I started, as I got older, and realized how life works, the tremendous number of coincidences, and it's like this. I was running a company for a number of years, big company, 600 employees. And so you buzz through life and you really don't see a hell of a lot because you're very concentrated on what you're doing. Well, it's a little like that. Um, but then maybe you get off that speeding train, and you look at life a lot differently. And now you have time to see things and ask questions that you wouldn't ask, and to delve into things and to investigate deeper. So what I came to in the beginning, I treated it, as I said, like a documentary about demonic possession and exorcism. But really, that isn't the story at all. This is a story of science, murder. I didn't know anything about the murders. I didn't know anything about Lizzie Borden. I didn't know anything about Juan Corriero. Didn't know anything about Rufus Hilliard, who's the best character in the book, probably. And so then I said, well, maybe look at how this fits together. This is a mosaic. This isn't some black and white photograph. This is a mosaic. And once I started to look at it that way, I realized this is a suspense thriller. This is a murder mystery. This is a psychological thriller. And this is a book about the paranormal and heavyweights, Sigmund Freud, William James, Morton Prince. These are, Leonora Piper, who was the clairvoyant of the day. I mean, these are weighty figures that are very interesting that I really didn't touch on at all in my first version of this when I was 20, I guess 24 is when I delivered it. So 22 to 24.
So I'm glad you brought up all those names because the next question I had for you revolved around your process for building a profile for what is essentially, at this point, a character in a novel, but rooted in a real life person. So, what
Yeah.
does that sort of, how do you build that profile and how do you draw a line between what you need from him for a story and character perspective versus
Yes.
what's actually true about this person?
Well, William Faulkner, the great novelist, American novelist, said you have to learn to kill your darlings. And that's a really one of the real great tenets for a writer. So you want to draw your character, but the book isn't about William James. So you have to understand that William James, there's so much information about William James, and the artistry of writing, I think, is to put just enough information so that you understand the character, you can see the character in your mind, and he plays out his role in the story. If you get sidetracked, Aristotle had another great line. He said, a novel, or let's call it a novel, should be like a fellow with a bow and arrow. There's the target. Here's the bow and arrow. The arrow should go straight to the target. Anything that deviates, anything that moves that arrow to one side or another should be cut. And so, what the skill probably is to know how much to put in so that people feel like they know this person, can see this person in their mind, and then really the person sort of acts out their role like an actor on the stage for the writer. Yeah. But it was difficult. This was not an easy book to write. And I'm just delighted that it came out so well. I'm really happy about that. It's gotten great reviews, as you know.
Yeah, yeah, I've been reading them. And I've also been listening to some of your other podcasts that you've been doing. So, in another podcast, you talked a little bit about how you modernize the language, specifically in dialogue.
Yeah.
And I wanted to understand more about that and why you made the decision to do that. Is it just strictly for our benefit, or was it easier from a in
No,
terms of your writing
it was more
process?
difficult. I mean, it's always easier to just take something off the page and say, okay, fine. This is in the public domain. It's from
Yeah.
records that I have the luxury of having access to and being able to publish. So let me just take it. But, if I read to you the same lines with words like whilst and, it's just a formality, like Dr. Prince, formal titles, Miss Fowler, that kind of thing. So at the end, you just want to make it accessible. You don't want to change the meaning. And as a matter of fact, in terms of the dialogue, particularly between Morton Prince, who was the primary physician, and Clara Fowler, the patient, almost all of it comes directly from transcripts or from Prince's book, Dissociation of a Personality. Now it's modernized again. And also there's a lot. If in a dialogue somebody starts talking about, I don't know, digresses. I mean, that's not something you want to keep in a book, or you'll have a 10,000 page book. So again, you need to be judicious in what you choose to put in and what you choose to leave out. And what I chose to leave out were things that were inconsequential to the story.
Okay, so I'm really open-minded about this stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know if I believe in it or not. Um, but I love the work of Malachi Martin. I think his writing is
Yes.
off the hook. So obviously I have an interest in this subject.
Uh-huh.
But I run this story by somebody like Jan, my wife, who is 100% a skeptic.
Mm-hmm.
And she immediately was like, well, how do they know it's not dissociative identity disorder? Which, for those of you who don't know, that's basically the new way of describing multiple personality disorder. And so, what are some of the details that strike you about Clara Fowler's story where you can say, well, this doesn't really correspond with any conditions, or this is just weird enough to make me think it's not this or that, or you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Let me start with something that
Give me
that
some ammo for my next discussion with Jan.
okay. Now I'm going to give you a lot of ammo for your next discussion. How's that? I'm going to give you a lot of ammo. But let me start with this, and we'll get to Clara Fowler in a moment, because I think those are the sort of one-offs, where there's a demonic possession that's demonstrable. And by the way, it's not been on the rise for the last 15 years or so. The number of exorcisms, the number of possessions, which generally they all, well, for the Catholic Church, where they've pretty much tripled the number of exorcists in the last 20 years, trained in the Vatican, and now there's a sort of an army of exorcists globally from the Vatican. So that's to meet the demand. But these are well trained and theologians and kind of soldiers in the battle against evil. But I was a deputy sheriff for about 3.5 years, and I transported federal prisoners. And I was in Arlington, Virginia, but because the Washington, D.C. jails were so overrun, some of the federal prisoners wound up in our facility, which was a new one and had room. And so I encountered hitmen, a guy that committed 80 murders, killed 80 people. I met a guy that, literally sat on somebody's chest while they were sleeping and just beat their head in their face in until they died. I met a biker who chained a 14-year-old girl to a tree and propane torched her to death. So were they possessed? Yes. Yes. And by the way, the guy that did the last thing I told you said, I would do this again. I like it. This is fun. And so you're not talking about somebody that commits a murder in the act of passion or does something bad and, the emotions running high. You're talking about somebody or an individual that, in my view, surrenders their soul to actually become evil incarnate. And that is almost my definition of demonic possession. They don't foam at the mouth. They don't, spew vomit. But what they do is reduce humanity to a brutish, animalistic state. And I think that there is a struggle between good and evil that goes on moment to moment for the souls of human beings. I believe in angels, and I believe in a Mother Teresa, who's an icon for goodness, human goodness, and I believe in Jack the Ripper, who is an icon for wanton evil. And I think human beings struggle moment to moment between those two. Now, for me, it might be, well, do I eat this candy bar tonight? I know I really shouldn't because I'm on a diet, but I'm going to sneak it away and my wife won't see. That's a kind of temptation that you subject yourself to and give into. But then there are increments. And once you get to a point where you're like the fellows that I described, I believe that you become walking, talking evil, and you become a demonic presence. And by the way, these guys, if you talk to them, they happen to be in jail. There's no capital punishment, but they'll kill a cop, they'll kill another inmate. They have nothing to lose. They're serving 500 years. What do they care? I mean, and by the way, they'll tell you, if you let me out again, I would find another 14-year-old girl and I'd do the same thing. So, these are very special kind of people. Just like Mother Teresa is a special kind of person, or the guy that, the soldier who, a hand grenade gets tossed into the platoon campsite. He jumps on the hand grenade with his helmet and dies to save his 15 buddies. So there are acts of goodness that are, beyond the norm, and there are acts of evil that are beyond the norm. But if you live your life that way, that's demonic possession, in my view. In Clara Fowler's case, her voice changed to that of I would say like a man, but it was explosive and it was like a roar, like unleashed energy. Her face literally remolded so that she was unrecognizable. And as a matter of fact, H. Holmes, America's first serial killer, who committed, I don't know the number, scores of brutal murders, dissecting people and selling their skeletons and God knows what else. He had a murder house in Chicago with operating tables and torture chambers where he literally burned people to death in a torture chamber and watched through a peephole. So these kinds of people are extraordinary to the extreme, and they exist, and they exist. So in Clara Fowler's case, and H. Holmes, when they hung H. Holmes and buried him, by the way, under 10 feet of concrete, they didn't recognize him. They said that the people, the clergy that talked to him, the guards and whatnot, didn't recognize the man they hung. Basically, his face had remolded into something else. That happened spontaneously with Clara Fowler. Her face would be like this, her face would be like that, and they would struggle for the body, for control of the body. She spoke in languages that, she had no knowledge of Greek or Aramaic or anything like that. She had the strength of 10 men. She raged at anything holy, rosary beads or church or priests or Bibles, reacted furiously to those kinds of things. In this altered state, and this was something William James really honed in on as a scientist. The second consciousness, as it was referred to, demonic presence, felt no pain, needed no food, needed no sleep, was never ill, was never fatigued, was fully conscious 24/7, every minute of every day. So this second consciousness knew the dreams of Clara Fowler, knew her wants, and this was really great, a great position to be in to torment her, which she would get notes. I have one here. I'll just read you one of the notes that she would find in the morning when she woke up. And here's one. Hypocrite, whore, how I hate you. The pains of hell shall come down upon thee. You shall find no help, no comfort in heaven or earth from my wrath. Not till student Clara is dead and puts a bullet through her head. Devil, devil, devil. The second consciousness wanted her dead, fatigued her, did anything to keep her from sleeping. So she would have these vicious, violent nightmares of rape and torture and demonic presence, demons are literally looming over her bed at night, to the point where she didn't want to sleep. She was afraid to sleep because of the dreams. When she tried to eat, if she had a steak or a piece of meat, she would see maggots coming out of it. So she didn't sleep, she didn't eat, and she was put into this sort of neurasthenic condition where just worn out, just, effete. And that's how she wound up coming to Morton Prince from a general practitioner, a guy named Jackson Putnam, who was also the Putnam family in Boston's a very prestigious name. But he said, and wrote a letter, I have the note, said, in other times, I hesitate to say it, but in other times, medieval times, we would be discussing demonic possession. And so she had these visitations on the one hand, these saintly life that she lived, but then on the other, all these other, this raging, angry, vicious, clairvoyant being would take over. The argument, maybe for your wife, is the argument that Leonora Piper had for Prince. She said, basically, Occam's razor, the most logical explanation, the easiest explanation is usually the true one. So she said, it's more likely that she's possessed by an outside spirit that that as a distinct personality lives this way, talks this way, does all the things, has all these characteristics I've described, than for a normal individual to have all of this phenomenon happen at one time to the same person. So the odds of all of these symptoms, telekinesis, all of this stuff happening to one person by natural causes, it would be like somebody getting pneumonia, measles, a virus. See what I mean? And so the more logical explanation is the one that's right in front of your face, and that's been going on for thousands of years. So those are some of the arguments I would put forward. And I do believe in demonic possession, particularly. Again, there are extremes, and there's many of them. Just go to YouTube. You'll see exorcisms. You'll see these people talking in different voices. You'll see the viciousness that goes on. But more than that, and there's the Jack the Rippers, there's the H.H. Holmes, there's the Lizzie Bordens, but there's many, many, many people whose names you'll never know that are as heinous and malevolent and malignant as those people that walk on the earth and are in prison systems and maybe not in prison systems.
Did you ever read Hostage for the Devil?
I did.
There's
I did.
one...
As a matter of fact, it was funny. When I first wrote the first cut at this book, which was called Christabel, a priest friend of mine was asked to review it. And so he had an advanced copy that he forwarded along to me. Yeah, so I read it very early along, and it's impressive.
Well, there's one part of it that I've never mentioned it on this podcast, but there's one part of it I think about a lot. It lives rent-free in my mind, where it's kind of in the beginning of the book, and they're talking about there was an exorcism going on in Nanking during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a failed exorcism in that they managed to get the entity out of this guy, but it was as if they weren't able to contain it or send it back. It kind of he describes it as being let loose onto the city, at which point the rape of Nanking transpired. And it's as if he describes it as if all of the soldiers became possessed by this thing that just wanted to destroy everyone for no reason. And that's why that's his rationale as to why the rape of Nanking was so severe compared to so many other things that transpired during World War II.
Yeah, I don't think that's crazy. As a matter of fact, the demonic presence talks about like references almost. Now you're talking about 1905 or so. I think World War I probably started in Europe maybe about 1914, something like that. We entered it late along, but maybe 1918, something like that. But it makes reference to, we capture souls by individuals and we rejoice over it by the thousands sometimes. But, I have bigger work to do. I have more work to do.
Why do you think there's something you mentioned earlier in our conversation that I'll probably get my ass kicked if I don't explore this more.
Sure.
That the Catholic Church is seeing more need for exorcists, and now you say we have an army of them around the world.
Yes.
Why? What do you think is happening right now where possessions are going up? It seems, or maybe just being identified.
And by the way, just to make it clear, it isn't just the Catholic Church. I mean, if you go to YouTube, you'll see ministers and probably as many or more exorcisms happen outside the Catholic Church, where the strictures are very tight, meaning you have to prove to a bishop. And then I think they probably, well, for sure now they have to go to the Vatican for approval of an exorcism. And so the only way they'll do that is when this is for your wife, when all psychiatric remedies and all psychiatric explanations are exhausted when people say there's nothing we can do about this. And so that's when the Catholic Church will do exorcisms. I think probably in some other faiths, it's not so regimented. Not, yeah, maybe regimented is the word. Not so, there aren't so many hurdles. So it's like sainthood in the Catholic Church. For somebody to become a saint, called a saint, there's a whole body of sort of hurdles that have to be proven and overcome before they'll entertain calling someone a saint. So also to answer your question, and this is a topic, I was just talking to a neighbor of mine who's a Vietnam vet. Poor guy is dying, Agent Orange. So he's older, but he suffered with the lung disease from Agent Orange for years. And I guess you get kind of retrospective when you only have a short time to live, which he does. And we just talked about the state of the world. And maybe it's a function of age, but I would say it's a function of relativity and a function of purview. But if I look at what goes on now, and actually there's a great line in No Country for Old Men, Cormac McCarthy's book and movie, where what you would consider even 20 years ago as like impossible, outrageously impossible, happens daily now. I mean, people get pushed in front of subways. They're out the next morning and everybody thinks that's fine. Cop gets killed. The guys that do it have 35 prior arrests for attempted murder and atrocious assault, and they're let go. I mean, it's a crazy world. I mean, you've got what's going on in Gaza, you've got what's going on in the Ukraine, and I think what to Father Martin's point of view, I think chaos. The devil loves chaos. Unity is the antithesis of evil, really. Unity, harmony, goals that are productive, creative, good. That's God's will. Chaos, disorder, the streets running red with blood, things like that. This is the devil's this is the devil's wheelhouse. What do you think?
I I don't know. I can't honestly say I haven't made a decision, but I am fascinated by the topic. I'm not completely closed-minded off to it. I continue to read about it because of my fascination with it. Like I said, the Nanking thing lives rent-free in my mind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I do think that there's a lot there that can't be explained through the psychiatric industry there. But that's really because I know someone who performed an exorcism.
Really?
And she didn't really have the authority to. And ever since then, her life has been a complete misery. And I think that is because she didn't have the authority. And by that, the spiritual authority. I think that there's at some level, you have to truly believe what you're preaching, what you're doing for it to be effective. And if you don't, you can be taken advantage of.
Well, it's called infection.
In fact, exactly. And I know you've used that word before in another podcast. And I would, some part of me is like, what if she got infected because she just shouldn't have done this exorcism? Mm-hmm. And that is something I think about a lot, because ever since then, she was a preacher, and she would have really profound sermons. And then ever since then, her sermons have been nothing but bitterness and resentful.
There was a psychiatrist that helped me out with some of the interpretations and language and whatnot in the Unwelcomed, and he became a friend, and he said that he dealt with it one time as a psychiatrist, and he said, "I will never ever get involved in anything like that again because I'm scared." Basically the violence, the vitriol, the hatred. Uh, he said, this is crazy, but true. He said, I locked myself in my office. I had to lock myself away from this person. They were clawing at the door, and I just said, I will never, ever be involved in anything like this again because it's too frightening from every level, from a paranormal level, from a physical level, from a but the interesting thing, Eric, and this is what I've been doing some reading on, and maybe you've read Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, probably in college, it's a great book. And then I've been reading another book uh, called The Case Against Reality. But mostly physicists now are conceding that with quantum mechanics and the like, the odds of us knowing what's real is zero. It's zero. So if you say that, if scientists and well-known Sir Francis Crick, the co-founder of DNA, says, we know zero about reality. What we see is what we want to see, and screen out, what reality really is. The brain's function, Huxley says, is really to screen out things that don't involve evolution, survival, food, procreation, a place to rest. That is what the brain's function is. Most people think, like me, that the brain's function is to look at the world around and interpret what you see. He says that what we see is not even a pinhole of what's real. And if that's the case, and if, for example, in Aristotle talks about an unmoved mover, a crater, if a bunch of dominoes fall, it could be 100 miles of dominoes, right? And you're at the end and you watch them all fall. There's really only one question. Who pushed the first domino? And when you start to get to those questions, you really wind up talking about things that are spiritual and things that are esoteric, and not, in a lot of cases, even something like light, and we call it light. So nobody even questions what is light. Well, I guess it's some wave of sorts, but there's ultraviolet light, there's infrared light, there's microwaves, there's radio waves. We don't see those, but they're all forms of light. They're all forms of, and so we're just blind to them. And I think that's a good analogy for our view of reality. If we see a disease, we call it, all right, fine, it's dissociation. Well, what does that mean? And many times it's just a label you throw on something, it doesn't mean you understand it. I mean, the air that we breathe, we don't see it, but we know it's there, or we assume it's there because we're inhaling something, but you don't see it. Only in California sometimes you see it.
Always in California. Yeah, I know that's a really great argument for just the paranormal in general, and
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. So I mean, if the world's great scientists, the Crick or whatever, Crick has a really interesting theory on he doesn't believe in evolution. And so this is the fellow, the co-founder of DNA. So he won the Nobel Prize for Science. So you're not talking about some lightweight. He said that the odds of evolution being true would be like a tornado going through a junkyard and leaving behind a 757 jet that takes off and flies to Europe. That's how remote the odds of evolution creating a brain, for example, the human brain, would be in the period of time that we know humans have existed on Earth. He says a more likely theory, and this was in a book called Life, is that that an advanced civilization took their DNA, put it in asteroids and meteors and things of that nature, and bombarded it through the universe or through many universes, and to sort of spread their existence. And going through Van Allen's belt, the radiation activated it. It wound up in a swamp, but evolution had this huge head start based on DNA. And that's how a human brain could evolve in the X number of years that humans have been on Earth. That's the explanation he gives. And you know what? I think that's really that rings very true to me. So you could just take Newtonian physics, like with quantum mechanics and all that, and just throw it out the window. Things that our view of what's real, what the Earth is, what existence is, I just don't think we know much about it at all. And it's a good thing we try, and it's a good thing we have a model to work with, or I guess we wouldn't survive. You need a model to work within, but it's a self-created model.
So has the Unwelcomed been released yet, or is it still in pre?
It's pre-ordered. You can pre-order it now on Amazon. The Unwelcomed, The Curious Case of Clara Fowler. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, thrift books, online, and you can order it in bookstores. It will be distributed in May. And so really from my end, I'm really anxious about pre-orders because, as you know, the more pre-orders you get, the bigger the number of books that are printed, and the larger the distribution. So it's a very important thing from my standpoint.
Will be even though I've read it. Now you were kind enough to send me a galley. I will pre-order it tomorrow.
Why? Thank you. I appreciate that.
It'd be an honor to have it in my library.
I'll do better than that. You order it and give it to a good friend, and I'll send you an autographed copy. How about that?
Deal.
Okay.
Even better. So, yeah, I know this was a great conversation. I love the paranormal. I definitely feel like we don't experience reality proper. We're sort of on the outskirts of reality. And I think you're right in terms of like, we're programmed to survive, not to digest what is actually happening.
Yeah, that's actually not me. That's Huxley. But,
yeah, Huxley.
I'll certainly
steal it.
I'll take credit for it.
Yeah, take credit for it. This is your second visit here. You're welcome back anytime you want, even if you don't have a book, just so you know.
Sounds great, Eric. I always enjoy. We have such great discussions, and you're such an easy guy to talk to,
Thanks. Yeah, I try to keep it low stakes. Try to keep it about craft most of the time. When you're talking about craft and the paranormal, though, it's the perfect storm for having a podcast.
Yeah, I'm sure. Particularly being in the arts yourself, you're a filmmaker, you're a broadcaster, and
did I ever tell you about the paranormal thing that happened while we were filming?
No, please.
Do you want to hear it? Okay, I don't think I mentioned it I mentioned it on Jim Harold's podcast, but not my own. So our movie is about a guy. He meets this woman. They're married, and their relationship exists for 3 years, and then she passes away. But early in their relationship, they make a deal that whoever dies first has to let the other know if there's something more, which is, I guess, something a lot of couples do. Mm-hmm. And that's the story of our movie. He inherits her cottage after she dies, and he goes out to it to spend time writing about her, essentially waiting for a sign. And we filmed it on this remote island in the Gulf of Maine. It takes about an hour by ferry to get out there. All dirt roads. The cottage isn't even winterized, so it's cold.
Sort of spooky.
It's spooky, but beautiful. And part of the story is he finds an old record player with all these old gospel records. And so I went around Maine looking for all these old records that I could bring out. And I only owned one record at that point, which was framed. It was an old Johnny Horton record. And I took it out of the frame and I put it in the pile because I'm like, I have no reason to bring it, but I feel like it needs to be out on the island with me.
I'll give you another coincidence. I just heard Johnny Horton sing yesterday on the radio, and I don't think I've heard Johnny Horton sing in 40 years.
I've never heard him on the radio ever, so that's another addition to this coincidence. But so I bring it out, we're filming, and then I send my actor to the mainland because I wanted to give him a break. Mm-hmm. And I'm listening to Jim Harold's podcast, and he's talking about how Johnny Horton and his producer made the same pact. They're like, whoever dies first has to let
Really?
the other know, and here's the code phrase: the drummer is a rummer, and he can't keep the beat. And years later, a psychic on a radio station in New York says she keeps getting a phrase from a spirit named, and she just gives the guy's first name. I forget his producer's name, but it's his first name. He died first. Or maybe it was Johnny. I don't remember who died first, but the phrase was the drummer is a rummer. He can't keep the beat. So this is a message for so-and-so. And the person who was still alive was like, oh my God, that's the guy I used to make music with. And so I'm listening to this podcast and I'm like, holy crap, that's what my movie's about. And wait a minute, I brought a Johnny Horton record out to the cottage for really no real reason.
Yeah.
And so I was telling that to Jim Harold. And the other weird thing too is it's the only record I ever owned, even though I never owned a record player. And the reason I own it was because the people who gave it to me were selling their house and moving to Canada in the early 90s. And I went by their yard sale to say hello. And the matriarch of that household said, oh, Eric, I have something for you. And she gave me the Johnny Horton record. And I'm like, well, I don't have a record player. And she goes, no, well, you should have it. I'm like, why? Well, because you should have it. I feel like you should have it. I'm like, okay. And so literally it's one of the few things from my childhood I was able to retain all these years.
Wow.
In the early 2000s, I worked for Virgin Records. So they gave away record frames. So I just framed it because I had a free record frame. And in my closet, it stayed for years and years and years. And it was a perfect storm of, wait a minute, this record has been with me all these years. For no reason at all, I decided to bring it to this island, put it in the pile of records. We never see it in the movie.
Coincidences
Yeah.
like that.
And
I was just talking to my wife about that. Exactly.
but the
that.
fact that,
Full
though,
of coincidence.
that they were able to
Incredible.
verify
What are
the
the
afterlife.
odds? What are the odds of those things happening?
Yes, it's so
I'll
perfect.
give you one. Do you know Betsy Lewis, who has a show, Stargate Radio?
Oh yeah, I've listened to Stargate.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I didn't know who Betsy Lewis was, and I had this great friendship with Bill Blatty, William Peter Blatty, right? So I had written Mojave Incident, but it was called Searchers in a previous edition. The original edition was called Searchers: A True Story of Alien Abductions. Of Searchers. It was a hardcover. So she buys it at a yard sale and puts it away and forgets that she put it on her bookshelf. And she's doing some research and it falls off the bookshelf. So she picks it up and reads it and says that this is a great book. She contacts me through my literary agent at the time and says, I'd like to do a broadcast. I said, great. So we get along famously. And somehow or another, I probably was talking about the Unwelcomed. This was years ago, but still, I was, like I said, this has been going on for a long time. And he goes, oh, my sister married Bill Blatty. Her sister married Bill Blatty.
That's cool.
And so we become, we're buddies since then. But how about that for a coincidence? Yeah. Falls off the shelf. I mean, what are the odds of these kinds of things happening,
Yeah, it didn't fall off the shelf.
But I mean, again, just look at Las Vegas odds on these kinds of things and say, well, what would Las Vegas say? What are the odds? 100,000 to 1, 1,000,000 to 1? And then you say, well, if they happen pretty often, which they do, certainly happen to me pretty often, I might have mentioned, I think earlier, that I was with yesterday afternoon a neighbor who I never really met before. I met him on the street one time. He's dying, Agent Orange, Vietnam vet, and so I went over. I brought some sandwiches and a couple of sodas, and we talked. And he told me about Vietnam and his experiences and his terrible experiences coming back, where people were a lot less than friendly to veterans at the time. And so I spent, I don't know, maybe 2.5, 3 hours with him. So then a couple hours after that, I had an interview with a fellow, um, a podcast, and he goes, and I was in Vietnam. Turns out he was suffering from the after effects of Agent Orange, and like I said, I had never met somebody that suffered with Agent Orange. The last time I talked to a Vietnam vet at any length was, I don't know, 30 years ago. And now within 2 hours, I'm talking to two Vietnam veterans, both of whom suffered, the after effects of Agent Orange. And I think that's just what are the odds? Again, you're just so weird, right?
Yeah. I love it when that happens.
No, it's a strange existence. It's a great existence. I mean, living is fun and wonderful, but there's certainly more to it than meets the eye. That I think we could all agree on. Maybe your wife as well. I think so, right?
Well, I once heard someone say that the universe communicates in synchronicities. And I love that.
It's a
I
great
love
line.
that phrase. Yeah. I
It's
don't
a
remember who
great
said
line.
it, but it's perfect.
It's a great line.
Ron, we've had an awesome conversation here, and it will be out before the end of this month.
Great.
And I
Great.
really appreciate you reaching out to me.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much, Edgar. I really enjoyed it. I consider you a friend.
Thank you. Likewise. Anytime you want to come back, with or without a new
And so
book.
you're in Maine these days, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're right in Maine.
And I'm
And
in Florida, so that's not so easy. But maybe we'll meet in New York one
you
day.
know what? There's a road that goes straight here, Route 1, Maine to Florida.
All right. I have to get a faster car.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Ron.
All right. Take care of yourself. Bye
Bye.
bye.
And that was my conversation with Ron Felber. And again, Ron, I really appreciate you reaching out to me to come back on the podcast. It got me going again with productions of the show, which was really, really important. I'd been meaning to do it for a while, but just I didn't have the inspiration to until now. And now I'm just like, oh, a fire was lit under me to keep going. And so I really, really appreciate that. Loved your writing. I've always loved your writing. And this new book is kick ass. It just kicks ass. And I'm going to redo this. And that was my conversation with Ron Felber. Ron, thank you again for reaching out to me. It lit a fire under my butt, to be honest, because I'd been wanting to reboot the podcast, but I just hadn't had the energy or the inspiration to do so. But once you reached out to me, I was back in it. Back in that same headspace I needed to be in. And so I really appreciate that. You really helped me out. And I also just love talking to you about the craft of writing, about your writing practice, and of course, the paranormal, which you're really, really good at. So everyone, stay tuned. Keep subscribed because we're going to have more episodes like this. And we're going to have new types of episodes coming up at some point very, very soon. But yeah, we're back in business on this thing. And Jay, I know you're listening. Jay, I'm sorry I haven't had Avi on, man. But maybe we'll have him on a third time at some point down the road. It's just not my priority at this time. But I hope that you don't unsubscribe. Please keep listening. It's nice to have you. All right. Thanks, everybody, and see you on the next one.